My project presentation is on the effects of obesity on perceived competence of individuals. So brief agenda, cover introduction, data cleaning, the exploratory data analysis that was performed, some modeling, the model evaluation, and then conclusions of the work that was done. So this project, since I am working full time and do not have a research thesis, I just pulled an existing study and made the attempt to evaluate the data that was presented in that study to re-examine the fundamental conclusions. The reference paper that I pulled from was titled "The Effective and Interpersonal Consequences of Obesity" by Levine and Schweitzer. Published in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, volume 127. For this particular effort in the project, I decided to limit the scope to just the initial pilot study they ran. They actually wound up doing 5 individual studies where they varied certain aspects, but due to the complexity, I just stuck with the first one. For that pilot study, there was 152 survey participants, 84 male, 66 female, with a median age of 33 years old. They were given an obesity classification where they were told that the survey participants were told the person was obese or healthy. They were also given one of a binary gender assignment, male or female. They were given an arbitrary height, an arbitrary weight, and the person's name was Alex Moore. Survey participants then scored the fictitious Alex Moore on a 1 to 7 scale, where 1 was considered bad and 7 was considered good. And they scaled how they perceive defining attributes of that person based off of just the simple description and nothing else. Categories such as obesity, competence, intelligence, and 8 other variables. For this study, we focus on the relationship between perceived obesity and perceived competence. For the data cleaning, there were several outliers in the data. There were 2 responses that gave mostly 1s for every single category except for 2. Just out of simplicity, I decided to leave that data in the set since there was only 2 of them. But out of the 11 categories that were scored, since I'm just focusing on the effects of obesity and competence, those were the only 2 data sets that were used from the survey. To do a basic exploratory data analysis, I created a general scatter plot of the perceived competence versus perceived obesity. And what this chart is telling us, again, it's on 1 to 7 scale, where 1 would be not very overweight and 7 would be very overweight or extremely overweight. 1 would be incompetent and 7 would be very competent or greatly competent. So just doing this initial scatter plot, we can see that there appears to be a quite random scatter of data, but there does seem to be there's something of a noticeable downward trend. One thing to notice is that all of this data has been degenderized. This is for my first evaluation. It was just regardless of gender, whether they, their correlation between how they viewed them as obese compared to their competence perception. For a second consideration, I did split it out and aligned with a box plot the female healthy versus female obese and male healthy versus male obese in relation to their competence. As we can see from this, the difference between the male healthy and male obese perception on competence is somewhat different, but it's not quite as noticeable as it is on the female side. So those are the targets for my 2 models. One is a non-genderized, just across the board study model, and the other one is an actual genderized model. So performing a linear regression of the combined model, there is a clear negative relationship between increasing weight and decreasing competence. there's a negative 0.14 unit decrease in competence for every 1 unit increase in perceived obesity. Uh, However, the R squared only gives us about a 9%. It only accounts for about 9% of the variance. So this particular model is really, it's not that good. For our second model, I broke it out. So I actually created three. I broke it out into male versus female. For the male, there was almost, there's very little, very little difference, that this model is not a good predictor at all. And even the p-value is insignificant. So from the male perspective, it's not very good. Doing a linear regression of just the female genderized model, the effects are drastic compared to the male model, with the with a negative, almost a quarter unit decrease in perceived competence for every unit increase in perceived obesity. So based off of this immediate modeling, the model for males is very it is not very well correlated, but for females there's a clear trend. Obviously, this would ideally need to be a little bit higher for it to be considered good, but it's still very high compared to the other two. Looking at the residuals of the models, the combined model seems relatively uniform. There's a little bit of stair stepping, and it goes outside of the bounds a little bit, but I think it's generally appropriate. For the male and female, the male residual models are just they're very poor. The female models are a little better, but they still go outside of the boundary some as well. So for model evaluation in the combined regression, again, as I said, the model only explains about 9% of the variance. Is not very good, but the AIC, BIC, and log likelihood do show improvement over the base. And the log likelihood test does show a difference between the two models, and the predictors from this model do help. Looking at the male-focused regression metrics, as I mentioned earlier, the R-squared value is useless. There's little improvement over the base model, and there's little difference between the two models. The predictor does not help. So the male data is very poor. For the female-focused regression, the model explains 25% of the variance. There's a noticeable improvement, and the predictor does seem to help. Looking at backcasting plots, the data is very spread out. There's a lot of variance in the plots, so it's the usefulness of these models are very limited. So in conclusion, there is clear bias towards perceived obesity and perceived competence. This agrees with the paper's fundamental conclusion, both as a whole and from that initial pilot study. The correlation is much stronger for females versus males, but the correlation for males is insignificant and very limited and unuseful. The models that are created are not really up to par to be used with real certainty. So the overall result of the data analysis that was performed is an interesting conclusion, but don't know that it could be used for any real scientific study. Any questions?